Well, I predicted that after everybody spent a long, sometimes in some people's case, restless night last night with the elections, that I might be talking to myself in here this morning. But I'm glad to see those hardy souls who did get some rest last night come out and join us here at the museum this morning. A couple of things I'd like to point out real quick. First and foremost, our 2016 Christmas cards for the museum came in, and they are available at the coffee table to your rear and at the sales counter as well. There's also 8x10 prints of this year's illustration, which is that painting. This is the original that Dustin Termeyer produced earlier this year. It's a 1950s Christmas scene in downtown Granite Falls, and that's what's on our Christmas card for this year. So be sure to get you some cards and support the museum while you're here this morning, and particularly if you've got fans, family, and friends in the southern part of the county. I hope that this will address somewhat the often heard refrain around here, we put too much emphasis on Lenoir. So there you go. Also, an unlikely and hopefully unlikely event that we would have some type of emergency here this morning. There are exits at either end of the hall to your right. And of course, there's an exit on the north end of the building and the front doors. The restrooms, for anyone who's not visited here before, are through this door and to the right, down the leftward hall for the ladies, and all the way down the hall and to the left for the gentlemen. So, if you have any electronic devices like your cell phone or a tablet or anything of that nature, Bill Tate back here, our erstwhile documentarian who always records these programs for us, does request that you turn those off before we get going too much, because it seems to have a tendency to interfere with our very fickle equipment around here, which was acting up this morning as well. We've been doing these programs on our large screen TV, and apparently we have some issue with the cable to it, so we're back to the more ancient method of a projection screen. So I hope that'll work out well. It's not showing up on my computer screen, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to sort of stand by the side and look at the screen with you so I can go from slide to slide. But of course, what we're going to talk about today a little bit is Caldwell County's rather prodigious contributions and sacrifices in our nation's wars over time. Of course, Veterans Day coming up here Friday. It seemed to be an appropriate time of the year to talk on this topic a little bit. And because of time limitations, I regret to say that I can't make mention of all those young men and women who gave their lives to our country from Caldwell County, but I hope to highlight a few down through the ages. Of course, this nation's first war is the Revolutionary War. Now, this is well before the age of photography, of course, so we have no photographs of Revolutionary War soldiers, only paintings and characterizations of them. Certainly, one of the most prominent Revolutionary War figures in this area was William Lenoir, who we often refer to in these parts as General Lenoir. A bit of explanation in that regard. William Lenoir at the time of the Revolutionary War was a captain in the North Carolina militia. He did not become a general until the early 1800s, and again, he was a general, a major general of the North Carolina militia. But at the time of the Revolutionary War, when Caldwell County was still part of both Wilkes and Burke County, William Lenoir raised a company of troops to fight. Now, these men in his company were largely from the area that would become Caldwell County in 1841. but at that time they were scattered over what is now Burke, Wilkes, and Caldwell County. His company and Captain Lenoir took part in the engagement at Kings Mountain in March 1780, and he himself took a rather conspicuous role in that fight, receiving several bullet holes in his clothing during the engagement. Now, of course, we also had elements in this area of men who remained loyal to the king and fought as loyalists. The Powell family comes to mind, the first Powells to establish a dwelling here in Caldwell County over near where Trinity Methodist Church is located now, and what we often call the Keyhole Church, was a veteran of the Loyalist troops during the Revolutionary War. In fact, he had fought at Kings Mountain too against William Lenoir and the other patriots who were fighting against Ferguson's force atop Kings Mountain. But the Powell family established themselves in a log cabin over there where the church is now. The Powells were from Wales, England, and there was a tradition in Wales that if one would put a keyhole design in the exterior wall of one's dwelling place, it would give an outlet for any evil spirits in the home to get out and stay out. Now, this became a factor in the Powell family thinking after this log cabin that was initially built burned. And the elder Powell's son replaced it with a two-story brick house, which was only the second brick house built in Caldwell County. And when that house was built, he did in fact put the keyhole design up underneath the gable of the house beside the chimney. Apparently this worked because the brick house never burned, and the Powells were never complaining of evil spirits plaguing them after that. In fact, they were forerunners of the furniture industry in the county and a very prosperous family. John Starke Ravenscroft Miller, now that's a mouthful there, isn't it? He typically would sign himself J.S.R. Miller. He was a grandson of Parson Miller, who established himself early in this area and would be a founder of the Episcopal Church in the county. But John Starke Ravenscroft Miller was an interesting young man. He had belonged to the United States Army before the Civil War, getting in right after the Mexican War. And he survived his experience there, and then when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, he becomes an adjutant of a cavalry unit here in North Carolina, and then later as a captain in a line regiment, and lost his life in the war. I'm going to sort of show you photographs of these, a sampling of these young men from Caldwell County who died in service, simply because when I get on into the program a little later and start talking about numbers, units, and the dry minutiae of military life, it's kind of hard when you're dwelling on those type of subjects to appreciate the actual cost involved. Numbers don't always translate very well in our minds to human loss. And I would urge you to look into the faces of these young men as we go through these pictures. Over atop the piano over here are photographs as well of Caldwell County natives who lost their lives in more modern wars than what I'll have time to get to on my PowerPoint program, but they're identified by name and the date of their death. Most of them lost their lives in Vietnam or the Iraq conflicts. And unfortunately, research continues on verifying the men and women that we have lost in more modern wars that seem to occur with disturbing frequency in our own times. George Washington Hood was the son of a very prominent family here in Caldwell County too. He's wearing in this image here a rather unique uniform. It appears to be a cadet uniform of some nature. Now, young G.W. Hood was a student before the Civil War breaks out at the Findlay Academy here in Lenoir. Now, that academy was a male school which had been sponsored and created by the local Presbyterian church here in town. And it had apparently a quasi-military school concept to it. And if you've ever visited our gallery behind you in the Civil War section back there, you'll see about 6 or 7 young Caldwell men who fought in the Civil War wearing this type of uniform. So we strongly suspect, since there's no evidence, that they were cadets at the 2 other principal military schools in North Carolina at the time of the war, the North Carolina Military Institute, which was situated down in Charlotte, and the Hillsborough Military Academy down in Orange County. We suspect strongly that the men in these photographs wearing that particular black braided shell jacket, or possibly coatee, were students here at the Findlay Academy prior to the commencement of the Civil War. The Findlay Academy survived on through the war. It was taken over by Edward Fawcett during the war itself. Captain Fawcett, as he was referred to, would become an early mayor of Lenoir. He was a captain in the Home Guard here in Caldwell County during the war as well, since he was too old to serve actively in a line regiment. When Stoneman came through town with his 4,000-man Union Cavalry Division on Easter Sunday of 1865, the only structure in Lenoir that was purposely burned by Union troops was one of the 2 buildings of the Findlay Academy. Now, that school was situated up north side of town where Bellevue Cemetery is located at now. At the time of the Civil War, the cemetery had not yet been established. And I presume the reason for the Union troops burning the school building is that they felt that it was somewhat of an incubator of Southern rebellion by teaching these young men military experience, and that they were going to teach a lesson to those who conducted the school. Fortunately, the rest of Lenoir didn't suffer under any flames, although quite a few local residents of the town were robbed and stolen of property, but no structures were burned. George Washington Hood, in the very prime of his life, would be killed in the war as well, and his body was never retrieved and never sent home. John Thomas Jones was the son of the prominent Jones family in what was then referred to as the Valley. We call it Happy Valley now. His home, Clover Hill, still stands in the valley, near where Highway 268 and Indian Grave Road intersect on the north side, well, it'd be the south side of the river, I guess. Beautiful brick home built in the early 1800s. As the clouds of war began gathering in the spring of 1861, John Thomas Jones was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And when North Carolina, the last state of the 11 states of the Confederacy to secede from the Union, did in fact pass an ordinance of secession on May 20th of 1861, John Thomas Jones joined a company of troops being raised primarily from students at the University of North Carolina. It was called the Orange Light Infantry. And he served in that unit at the first land battle of the war, which was called Big Bethel, up near Norfolk, Virginia. That regiment that he served in, the 1st Regiment North Carolina Volunteers, had only been organized for 6 months service because no one down here in the sunny South could possibly imagine that it would take much more than 6 months to whip all of Yankeedom, and that they would be back home. Sadly to say, that would not prove to be the case. And when John Thomas Jones's 6-month tour of duty ended, he came back home here to Caldwell County, and he would help organize the 3rd company raised in Caldwell, which would become Company I of the 26th Regiment North Carolina Troops, also referred to as the Caldwell Guards. Captain Jones at that point led his company in a very distinguished regiment from North Carolina up until July of 1863, when at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, he found himself in the rather unenviable spot of seeing both his colonel, 21-year-old Harry King Burgoyne, shot and killed while carrying the regiment's colors, and then the lieutenant colonel of the regiment shot through the jaw when he picked up those same colors, and 14 other men who would carry that flag that day would fall in succession. Jones, by that time, is the major of the 26th North Carolina, which makes him the 3rd ranking officer of the regiment. And by the time the 3-day battle was over, Major Jones would find himself no longer in command of his regiment because of the loss of his 2 other senior officers, but because of the widespread losses in his brigade, commanded by James Johnson Pettigrew, and Pettigrew's own wounding in that fight. He would be the only field-grade officer left in Pettigrew's brigade and would assume command of the brigade and conducted in the retreat back to Virginia. In May of 1864, by now promoted to lieutenant colonel of the 26th Regiment, he finds himself in command of that regiment again during Grant's overland campaign in the spring of 1864. And at the Battle of Wilderness, Virginia, he comes up against a line of Union artillery, which is loading up canister. Now, canister, unlike a cannonball, is a way to turn a cannon into a huge shotgun. The canister rounds are small balls packed into a can with black powder behind it, and when it's fired, it's meant to be used as an anti-personnel discharge, and it's very deadly. Lieutenant Colonel Jones, seeing the Federals were about to let loose with this deadly barrage on his regiment, ordered his men to go to a prone position along the Orange Turnpike, hoping that his men would miss the worst of the Federal artillery discharge. Unfortunately for John Thomas Jones, one of those canister rounds raked across the back of his body. He did not die immediately, but was taken to a field hospital in Orange Courthouse, Virginia, where he died that night. The surgeon of the 26th North Carolina informing him that he could not possibly survive his wound, John Thomas Jones answered the surgeon by saying, in the records at least, he said that it cannot be so. I am meant for much more. But he, like so many other young men in that fight, would find their lives cut short. Walter Lenoir Jones was John Thomas Jones's younger brother. And he starts off the Civil War in the very first company raised here in Caldwell County, which would become Company A of the 22nd Regiment North Carolina Troops. Their local company name always amuses me. They call themselves the Caldwell Rough and Ready Boys. That's the A on top of his hat indicates that service. So when that image was taken of Walter Lenoir Jones, he was still in the 22nd North Carolina in the first year and a half of the war. When his older brother comes home from his service in the first 6 months of the war and organizes a company here in Caldwell County, he transfers to his brother's newly formed company, the Caldwell Guards of the 26th North Carolina, and would fight with them again till Gettysburg. And literally before his older brother's eyes, young Walter Lenoir Jones is shot through the head on the first day of the fighting at Gettysburg. His body and his older brother's body, who died about a year later, were fortunately retrieved by the Jones family after the war had ended and were brought home, and they now rest side by side in the small cemetery located at Chapel of Rest. You may be familiar with these two young men's names. They gave their names to the American Legion post here in Lenoir up on North Main Street. Both these young men died during World War I in France, and regrettably they still lie in the soil of France and not in their native land. But because they were the first two men from Caldwell County to die in World War I, when the American Legion Post was organized after that war, they lent their names and their records to the establishment of the local American Legion Post. Doane Raymond Moore was a young Marine during World War II. He was one of the first in the United States Marine Corps from this area to die during World War II. And as is the case oftentimes with deaths during World War II, the family first receives word of that sad occurrence from the War Department. It was still called the War Department back then, not the Department of Defense. And on April 15th of 1945, Major General Peck of the United States Marine Corps, who was the acting commandant of the Corps during the war, wrote dryly to this young Marine's parents, "It is a source of profound regret to me and to his comrades in the Marine Corps that your son, Sergeant Doane Raymond Moore, United States Marine Corps, lost his life in action against the enemies of his country, and I wish to express my deepest sympathy to you and members of your family in your great loss. There is little I can say to lessen your grief, but it is my earnest hope that the knowledge of your son's splendid record in the service and the thought that he nobly gave his life in the performance of his duty may in some measure comfort you in this sad hour." And this, with many other such letters, greeted the folks back home in Caldwell County during that struggle against Nazism and fascism. Edward Eugene Green was one of the early casualties of the Vietnam War from Caldwell County. His photograph is also over here. As you can see, times change, but people don't. And the price we pay for the conflicts that we fight are borne greatly by the youth of our country. And God bless them for it, but it is a terrible price to pay when you look into the faces of these young men and think about the promise that may have held forth for that life had these young men survived. Johnny Ferguson, Private First Class Marine Corps, killed in action on June 8th, 1967 in Vietnam. He apparently stepped on a landmine in the Mekong Delta. Jason Ramseyer was a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps, killed in action on April 20th of 2006 in Iraq, the first Iraq war that we engaged in. And Larry Bowman, known locally to most people as Bobby, was a sergeant in the United States Army, killed in action on April 13th, 2007 during his second tour of fighting in Iraq. By the time we get into the second Iraq conflict, it would not be unusual to see some of these young men deploy 5 or 6 times to a combat zone. It's just sheer madness to think that a human being can tolerate such abuse for that long. In the Revolutionary War, what would become Caldwell County was still, of course, as I said, part of Wilkes and Burke. There were 2 companies of militia formed in this area under Captain William Lenoir and Captain Peter Thompson, respectively, that included men from what is now Caldwell County, and in all, about 200 men. Now, the militia then, as it has been all through time, is a force of everyday folks, farmers, yeomen, shopkeepers, who are called out for emergency duty. There's no firm record of how many men from Caldwell County served in the Continental Army, which was what the regular United States Army was referred to during Revolutionary War times, but it's thought that at least about 40 men served in Continental service during the Revolutionary War. The War of 1812 would come next, and again we'd be fighting the British, and we're still not yet formed, of course. Caldwell County not being formed until 1841. Again, most of the men from what would become Caldwell served in the 13th Company of the 2nd Burke Regiment, 9th Company of the 15th Cavalry Brigade, and the 5th Wilkes Regiment, and included about 49 men from what would become Caldwell County who served during the War of 1812. The War with Mexico, very little is known about local participation in this particular war. There was only 1 regiment raised in North Carolina for service in Mexico in 1846. And the only thing I have been able to run across is a 1894 newspaper article which identified one man, one Jason Martin, who apparently was among the first to enlist in this area and served in a company commanded by William J. Clark. Jason Martin may have thought he had done his duty and saw the horrors of war he wanted to see, but he would still be fit enough when the Civil War starts in 1861 to join Company I of the 26th Regiment North Carolina Troops and rose to the rank of 5th Sergeant. Now, that rank's sort of unusual for those of you who may have served in the military yourself. During the Civil War, an infantry company would have a captain, a first, second, and third lieutenant, and 5 sergeants. So, Mr. Martin served as the junior sergeant of that company during the war. He would survive not only the Mexican War, but the Civil War as well. And when the war between the states begins in 1861, Caldwell County would send forth a little over 1,100 men from this county, an astounding figure given the fact that that's more males than were eligible to vote here in the election of 1860. So if you were a male and you had a pulse and 2 opposing teeth, you probably served during the Civil War. And that's why there's so many Caldwell County men who serve. Now you'll note the slide indicates that we have one known woman from Caldwell County, who would serve during the Civil War. That would be Melinda, quotation marks, Sam Blaylock. She actually, her and her husband, joined the Confederate Army early on in the 26th North Carolina, in fact, and saw some brief service down in Newbern. Now the thinking is that the Blaylocks, who had rather strong Union leanings, really only joined the Confederate Army so they could get closer to the Union Army and then desert and serve with them. But by the time they get to their regiment, located down near Newbern in the eastern part of the state, the battle in March of 1862 had been fought, and the Confederate and Union armies are about 20-25 miles apart, making it very difficult to desert. So not to be deterred by distance, the Blaylocks came up with a scheme where her husband, Keith, would roll around in poison sumac, what we call poison ivy now, and get these running blisters all over his skin and body. And Keith went to the regimental surgeon, who probably didn't want to even get near him. And he was promptly discharged. When Keith was discharged, of course, quite naturally, his wife, who had been disguising herself as a man, Melinda, going by Sam, wanted to go home with Keith. So supposedly she went to the colonel of the regiment, who at that time was Zebulon Baird Vance, and said, "Colonel, I am actually a woman." Much to the amazement of Colonel Vance, of course, who felt like he needed some sort of corroboration of this story. So he called his regimental surgeon forth and said, "Surgeon, I have a case for you." And the surgeon took Sam into his tent and was able to successfully verify that Sam was in fact a she. So she was discharged along with Keith, and they came back to this area in what is now Avery County and became Latter-day terrorists. They literally waged war against their neighbors, friends, and acquaintances up in the Globe area of the county and further up into Avery and Watauga counties, and were just the terror of the area for almost 3 years, serving variously as scouts for Union troops and just generally a menace. Both of them would survive the war, despite the fact that Sam had one of her eyes shot out on one of the raids in the Globe area. And Keith lived to be quite an old fella in his 80s. He attempted to run for Congress under the Republican ticket, which wasn't such a terrible thing as it is these days. Because at that point, Caldwell was a very strong Democratic candidate. And of course, he went down in defeat because folks around here weren't going to be electing some neo-Yankee terrorist to Congress. And Keith, because of a great number of enemies he made in the area during and after the war, he went to work for the railroad, the Western North Carolina Railroad, and was on a hand car in his 80s now, bear this in mind, pumping a hand car down the railroad near what's now Eichard, North Carolina, being chased by some of his former enemies who were bent upon his destruction. And Keith met his demise by running that hand car off the rails, which killed him. Spanish-American War, 1898 and 1899. A very prominent local attorney, Edmund Jones, raised a company of volunteers from Caldwell, Burke, and Watauga counties, about 47 of which were actually from Caldwell County. And they served principally in Company C of the 2nd North Carolina Infantry Regiment and a few additional units as well. Now, the vast majority of men who volunteered for the Spanish-American War never really got into that war. Most of them were sitting in training camps in Florida and Alabama and never got across the sea to Cuba to fight. We do know that at least 3 Caldwell men were known to have actually become engaged in the fighting on the island of Cuba. And those were Calvin W. Winkler, J.D. Nelson, and J.F. Deal. In World War I, of course, the war had been going on for a number of years before the United States declared war and got involved in 1918. And according to a November 1st edition of the Lenoir News Topic, 669 men from Caldwell served in the armed forces during the war that would be known as the War to End All Wars, which unfortunately did not end war. About 54 of that number were either killed in action, mortally wounded, or died of disease. Many a young doughboy who would fight in that war was sent off from Lenoir on the very grounds of this building. The community had picnics for them before they sent them off to their training camps up here on Davenport Hill. And the community was so proud of their young men who fought in that war that they erected a memorial arch over on Norwood Street, which stood until trucks and vehicles had such height that they couldn't go under them anymore, and it was dismantled. But we do have some photographs here in the museum of that arch. In World War II, almost 3,116 men from Caldwell County served in the United States Armed Forces. And at least 101 of those men were listed as having died of various causes. And I suspect very strongly that the number of deaths at 101 is extremely low. It was more than likely much higher than that, but record keeping was not the best at the time. And there was no distinction made for those who were missing in action, a high percentage of which actually died during the war. What is known as the Forgotten War, the Korean conflict, 1950 and 53. We have been doing some research here lately of trying to determine the exact number of Caldwell men who served. The first Caldwell man to die in that war was Private First Class Leonard Spear of Company A of the 14th Combat Engineer Regiment on August 12th of 1950. And at least 9 of the Caldwell men were known to have lost their lives in Korea during that fighting. In Vietnam, we still don't have a firm figure of how many Caldwell men served in the fighting in Southeast Asia. The casualty reports in the local papers list at least 17 men dying in various units. And some of these men, and several who later died while serving in Iraq, again are remembered over here with their photographs above the piano. Gulf War Operation Desert Storm, early 1990s. At least 82 known Caldwell servicemen and women served in that conflict, and at least 2 of those servicemen were killed in action, and an unknown number injured or wounded. Now, war continues, of course. We're still in a war in Afghanistan. It looks like we're going to be continually bogged down in matters in the Middle East for some time, perhaps. So this story really doesn't end. My grandfather, who was a World War I veteran, would always use that phrase to describe the war he fought in as the war to end all wars. But as we sadly know, that was not the case then, it's not the case now. And now our young men and women remain in harm's way. Afghanistan has turned into the longest war this country has ever been engaged in. As a matter of perspective, if we go back to the Civil War, the casualties this country sustained then were not surpassed. In other words, the men we lost in all the wars this country has fought in, up until the end of the Vietnam conflict, did not equal the number that we lost during 4 years of war during the Civil War. So now we've surpassed that total, and the butcher's bill continues, I regret to say. And we have much to be thankful for all folks who have set aside their lives in service of a greater cause. And the young men and women who serve this country today carry on a long and proud tradition of that service, and we should ever be thankful for them. And as Lenoir Norwood wrote when she learned of the loss of one company at Gettysburg during the Civil War, the Highbrighton Guards, who lost all 94 of their men in that fight. She wrote home, she said, "They lie far from home, but at least at home they will not be forgotten." And that should always be our motto. These men and women should not be forgotten. And I don't think it's too much trouble for us to set aside one day a year to remember those who served and lost their lives, and those who served and survived and are still among us. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. I would encourage you, if you have time while you're visiting with us today, to please eat some more of them darn donuts. I'm watching my figure if you're not. But visit our military room upstairs. We have a lot of interesting displays about Caldwell's involvement during our many military adventures over the years. And our revolving display case to your left rear over here has some special items that we're putting out for Veterans Day as well. So folks, I appreciate your patience and your interest, and the fact that you're willing to take a few moments out of your busy day and probably a sleepless night to come here and share with us the memory of these great and good young men and women. Thank you again.
Please donate to our Caldwell Heritage Museum, 112 Vaden Street, Lenoir, North Carolina, 28645. Thank you.